The tragic case of Audrii Cunningham shocked the small community of Livingston, Texas, and the nation. An 11-year-old girl's disappearance and murder revealed flaws in the legal system and inspired a movement for change. This is the story of Audrii, her family's fight for justice, and the lessons learned from an unthinkable loss.
Audrii Cunningham was an 11-year-old girl from Livingston, Texas, known for her infectious smile and love for school. Her disappearance on February 15, 2024, sent shockwaves through the close-knit community. Audrii's morning started like any other. She prepared for school and headed toward her bus stop, but she never arrived. Her family reported her missing after school officials confirmed she was absent that day. Panic grew as the hours passed with no sign of her. The Texas Department of Public Safety and the Polk County Sheriff's Office launched a search, rallying community volunteers and law enforcement to locate the missing girl. 2 days later, a breakthrough came when authorities identified Don Stephen McDougal as a person of interest. McDougal, who lived in a camper behind the Cunningham residence, was familiar with Audrii and her family. He often helped by dropping her off at the bus stop or school. A critical clue emerged when Audrii's backpack was discovered near the Lake Livingston Dam. This find intensified the search and pointed investigators toward the Trinity River. The connection between McDougal's vehicle and the scene further solidified their suspicions. McDougal had a history of criminal behavior. In 2008, he pleaded guilty to enticing a child in Brazoria County, Texas, serving 2 years in prison. However, due to a legal loophole, he was not required to register as a sex offender, a fact that later devastated Audrii's family. On February 20, 2024, search teams located Audrii's body in the Trinity River. The Harris County Medical Examiner confirmed her cause of death as blunt head trauma and ruled it a homicide. The discovery brought closure to the search, but deepened the grief of her family and community. Audrii's grandparents, who had allowed McDougal to live on their property out of kindness, were left heartbroken. They expressed frustration that the legal system's oversight allowed a repeat offender to reside near children. The tragedy underscored systemic flaws in how sex offenders are monitored. Audrii's case reignited debates about the need for stricter registration laws and better protection for vulnerable individuals. Law enforcement and prosecutors worked tirelessly to gather evidence against McDougal. The community's collective grief transformed into a call for justice, with Audrii's story sparking national attention. Don Stephen McDougal was arrested on an unrelated aggravated assault charge shortly after Audrii Cunningham's disappearance. As evidence mounted, including connections to the scene and his proximity to the victim, he was charged with her abduction and murder. On January 17, 2025, McDougal entered a plea agreement, receiving a life sentence without parole or the possibility of appeal. Prosecutors noted that Texas law prevented them from seeking the death penalty due to McDougal's documented intellectual and developmental disabilities. The decision to accept a plea agreement was made to spare Audrii's family the emotional toll of a lengthy trial. While justice was served, the community grappled with the limitations of existing laws. Audrii's grandparents, devastated by her loss, became vocal advocates for legislative change. They proposed Audrii's Law, which would mandate that individuals convicted of crimes against children register as sex offenders, closing the loophole that allowed McDougal to evade scrutiny. The case highlighted the importance of community awareness and vigilance. McDougal's familiarity with the family and his prior conviction underscored the need for thorough background checks and enhanced monitoring of offenders. Public response to Audrii's story was overwhelming. Vigils were held to honor her memory, and social media campaigns raised awareness about the dangers of unregistered offenders. The community united in grief, turning their sorrow into a movement for systemic reform. Law enforcement agencies reflected on the case as a reminder of the need for swift and thorough investigations. The discovery of Audrii's backpack and the identification of McDougal's vehicle were pivotal in solving the crime. Audrii's Law gained traction among state legislators, with advocates emphasizing the need to prevent future tragedies. Her story became a symbol of resilience and the power of collective action to create change. The Cunningham family continues to honor Audrii's legacy by sharing her story and advocating for safer communities. Their courage in the face of unimaginable loss has inspired many to support legislative reforms to protect children. The case of Audrii Cunningham serves as a heartbreaking reminder of the importance of vigilance, community support, and justice. Her memory lives on through the efforts of those determined to ensure her story leads to meaningful change.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Deep Dive. And today we're going to be tackling a pretty tough case. The case of 11-year-old Audrii Cunningham from Livingston, Texas. She was just a bright young girl, the kind of kid who just lights up every room with her smile, loved school, loved her family. But her story took a really horrifying turn one February morning on her way to the bus stop.
Yeah, it's one of those cases that just really shook the community and forced everyone to kind of look in the mirror a bit and confront some really uncomfortable truths about how we protect children and the systems we have in place to do that.
Right. And that's why we have you here today to help us unpack all of this. We've got a ton of material to get through, articles, court documents, local news coverage, just a lot to get into to really understand what happened to Audrii and all the reasons why.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at, the events themselves, the legal proceedings and how the community responded. But we'll also touch on some of the more complex aspects of the case, like the legal loophole that allowed this to happen in the first place, and some of the ethical considerations surrounding the sentencing.
Okay, so let's start by setting the scene. February 15th, 2024. Audrii's heading out to her bus stop just like she does every morning, but she never makes it to school. What happened next just sent shockwaves through Livingston and beyond.
Yeah, the search for Audrii was massive and immediate. Local law enforcement, the Texas Department of Public Safety, volunteers, everybody was out looking for her. And then a couple days later, a man named Don Stephen McDougal, who actually lived on the Cunningham's property, became a person of interest.
And McDougal was a familiar face to the family. He was known to help Audrey get to school sometimes. But here's where it gets kind of complicated. This man had a prior conviction. Back in 2008, he was convicted of enticing a child. I mean, you'd think that would be a huge red flag, right?
Yeah, you'd think so, but because of a loophole in Texas law at the time, McDougal wasn't required to register as a sex offender.
Wait, so hold on. Help me understand this. How could someone with a conviction like that just slip through the cracks? It just doesn't make sense.
Well, at the time, Texas law didn't require registration for offenders whose victims were family members. And unfortunately, that was the case with McDougal back in 2008. So even though he had a history of this behavior, it wasn't something that would have shown up on anyone's radar.
Oh, wow. So Audrey's grandparents, who'd have been kind enough to let McDougal live on their property, had no idea about his past. I mean, this is just heartbreaking. They trusted him.
Yeah, and that trust was tragically misplaced. 5 days after Audrey went missing, the unthinkable happened. Her body was found in the Trinity River. The cause of death was blunt head trauma, ruled a homicide.
And the location of her backpack near Lake Livingston Dam, the connection to McDougal's vehicle, I mean, all the pieces just started to fit together.
Yeah.
And it was just this horrifying realization for everyone involved.
Yeah, and it raised so many questions about how someone like McDougal with a prior conviction could have been allowed to live so close to a child, undetected. It's just unbelievable.
So McDougal was arrested, but initially it was on an unrelated assault charge. It wasn't until the investigation really progressed that they got enough evidence to link him to Audrey's murder.
Right, and then eventually he was formally charged with her abduction and murder.
And, you know, for our listeners out there, the legal proceedings in this case took a bit of a turn that might surprise you. McDougal actually entered a plea agreement, and he received a life sentence without the possibility of parole.
And this is where things get really ethically complicated. Because of McDougal's documented intellectual disabilities, the death penalty wasn't an option under Texas law.
I can see how some people might think a life sentence, that's not enough for what he did, but there's always, more than one side to consider. It wasn't this simple case of seeking the most severe punishment.
No, not at all. The prosecution's decision was also very much influenced by the wishes of Audrey's family. They wanted to avoid the trauma of a long and drawn-out trial and get some measure of closure and justice as quickly as possible.
It's a good reminder that in cases like this, there are really no easy answers. There's this constant balancing act between justice and compassion, the needs of the victims, and the complexities of the legal system itself.
And, speaking of the family, they went through something unimaginable, but even in the midst of all that grief, they really chose to channel their energy into something positive, something really remarkable.
Yeah, they really did. I mean, they weren't content with just seeing McDougal punished. They wanted to ensure that nothing like this could ever happen to another family. And that's how Audrey's Law came about.
Exactly. They saw that loophole, the one that allowed McDougal to just kind of fly under the radar, and they were determined to close it for good. Audrey's Law is really all about trying to prevent future tragedies by, strengthening the very system that failed their granddaughter.
Okay, so let's get specific for our listeners. What exactly would Audrey's Law change? What would it look like?
Well, the biggest change, the key provision is that it would mandate sex offender registration for absolutely everyone convicted of a crime against a child. No matter the circumstances, no exceptions for family members, no more loopholes that people can exploit.
Wow, that's a pretty big change to Texas law. It seems straightforward enough on the surface, but I imagine there's some pushback on something like this.
Oh, there definitely is. Some people argue that it's just too broad, that it casts too wide a net and could lead to way too many people on the registry, which then makes it harder to focus on the truly high-risk individuals. They worry about the impact this could have on people who maybe committed a lesser offense years ago, maybe as a juvenile or something, and they've completely turned their lives around since then.
Yeah, that's a valid point for sure. It's important to think about those unintended consequences. It's not as simple as just saying, okay, register everybody.
Absolutely. Not at all. It's a complex issue, and that's why Audrey's Law has sparked such a, heated debate. It really forces us to confront some tough questions about justice rehabilitation and finding that right balance between protecting children and ensuring fairness within the legal system.
And, it's not just a legal debate either, right? I mean, this case has sparked such a powerful response from the community in Livingston and really across the state. People were outraged heartbroken, but also determined to do something to make a difference.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most striking things about this whole case. It wasn't just confined to the courtroom. There were vigils and social media campaigns and people raising money for Audrei's family. It really showed the power of a community coming together in the face of a tragedy like this.
And it really brought that conversation about child safety to the forefront. I mean, people were suddenly much more aware of the risks, the warning signs, and how important it is to be vigilant.
Yeah, it's a tragic reminder that these dangers can be lurking anywhere, even in the places we feel safest within our own communities and even among the people we trust. And it underscores the fact that protecting children is a responsibility we all share.
And speaking of community response, there's another important element to this case that I think we should explore. It's about that broader conversation surrounding child safety and how we can, create a culture of prevention.
That's a really crucial point, because while Audrei's law focuses on legal reform, there's just so much more we can do as individuals, as communities, to prevent these tragedies from happening in the first place.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about preventative measures. For the listener who's at home thinking, what can I do? What are some steps I can take to be more proactive about child safety in my own life?
Well, the first thing is knowledge is power. Educating ourselves and our children about personal safety, appropriate boundaries, recognizing those warning signs, that's critical. And there are tons of resources available online through local organizations, even within schools, that can help with this.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It's not about living in fear, right?
Yeah.
But about, equipping ourselves with the knowledge and the tools to make smart choices and recognize when something just isn't right.
Exactly. And then there's communication. Encouraging that open dialogue within families, schools, and communities about these issues can make a huge difference in creating a safer environment for everyone.
So it's not just about talking to our kids. It's about creating a space where these conversations feel normal, where kids feel comfortable coming forward if something's wrong, and where we as adults are ready to listen and take action.
Yeah, and let's not forget about technology and the role it plays. The internet can be a dangerous place, and it's really important for parents and caregivers to be aware of the risks and take steps to protect children online. Things like monitoring their activities, setting boundaries, having open and honest conversations about online safety.
It's a whole other level of complexity, but we can't ignore it. Technology's not going away, and we need to have the knowledge and the tools to navigate it safely, especially when it comes to our kids.
Absolutely. And while we're talking about prevention, there's one more thing I want to touch on. It's about recognizing those signs that someone might be struggling with harmful impulses and, seeking help before it escalates.
You're talking about potential offenders themselves. That's a really interesting angle. It's easy to focus on the victims and the punishment, but what about addressing the root causes of these behaviors?
Exactly. With McDougal's case, having that prior conviction and then slipping through the cracks like he did, it really raises some questions about whether there were opportunities for intervention along the way. Were there signs that could have been picked up on earlier? Were there resources available that could have helped him deal with his issues before they led to something so horrific?
It's a really complex issue, and there's no easy answer. But I think it's a conversation worth having. If we're truly serious about preventing these tragedies, we need to look beyond just punishment and explore ways to identify and support individuals who might be at risk of harming others.
It's about shifting our mindset from being reactive to being proactive. Instead of waiting for something awful to happen, how can we step in earlier, offer support, and potentially stop these cycles of harm from continuing?
It's a challenging concept for sure, and it requires a certain level of empathy and understanding that can be difficult, especially in a case as horrific as Audrei's. But I think it's a crucial part of the bigger picture.
It really is, and it brings us right back to the core of what we're talking about today. Audrei's case is a tragedy. It's a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities that exist all around us. But it's also a call to action. It's an opportunity to learn, to grow, to change, and to work towards a future where these tragedies become less and less frequent.
It's about pushing for better laws, better systems, better support for victims, and for those who might be struggling with those harmful impulses. Recognizing that it's a complex issue with no easy answers. But that doesn't mean we just give up.
Exactly. It means we keep asking those tough questions. We keep pushing for change. And we keep working towards a future where every single child can grow up feeling safe and protected.
It's about acknowledging that, this isn't just about Audrey. As devastating as her story is, this is about recognizing that this is a systemic issue something that we need to pay attention to.
That's it. We're talking about shifting our perspective, you know, moving away from simply reacting to these horrible events and being more proactive in addressing the things that lead to them in the first place.
Yeah. And, a lot of what we've talked about today is focused on legislation, legal reform. But what about the human element of all this? What about rehabilitation and, the possibility of redemption for these offenders?
Oh, that's a really important point. It's so easy to get caught up in that anger, that need for punishment. But what about stopping these crimes from ever happening in the first place? What about helping people who've committed these offenses to turn their lives around? To become productive members of society again.
McDougall's case, it brings up a lot of questions about how effective our current rehabilitation programs really are. Did he get the right kind of support after he was released from prison back in 2008? Were there even resources available to, address whatever issues he had and help him reintegrate back into society?
These are questions that we as a society really need to be asking ourselves. If we're really serious about breaking these cycles of harm, we need to invest in programs that go beyond just locking people up. We need programs that get to the root of these behaviors and give people a real pathway to change.
It's about understanding that, punishment by itself isn't always the answer.
Right.
We need to invest in solutions that help create a safer, more just society for everyone.
Yeah, and that means we need to shift the way we think about offenders. We can't just see them as criminals, They're individuals who might be dealing with, all sorts of things. Psychological issues, societal pressures, lack of support, who knows?
It's about recognizing that, true justice, it has to involve both accountability and that possibility of redemption. It's a tough conversation for sure, but it's one we can't shy away from.
And that's what makes Audrei's case so powerful. It's not just a story about something awful that happened. It's a call to action, It's a reminder that we all have a part to play in creating a world where these things happen less and less.
So as we wrap up this deep dive today, we want to leave our listeners with a few key things to think about. First, remember that knowledge is power. The more we understand about these complicated issues, the better equipped we'll be to actually make a difference.
Right. And second, never underestimate the power of your own voice. Whether it's supporting legislation like Audrei's law or getting involved with local initiatives or just, having conversations about child safety with your family and friends, every little bit counts.
And lastly, don't let Audrei's story fade away. Let it be fuel for change. A reminder that we can't afford to be complacent when it comes to protecting the most vulnerable among us.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's a tough topic, but it's so important. Keep learning, keep asking those questions, and keep working towards a future where every child can grow up feeling safe, loved, and empowered.